Hello, class. Now continuing on with our new Unit H on the legislative branch, I would like to make sure that you've read all of Chapter 11 in preparation for this next brief lecture and in order to get us prepared for some classroom activities. So today we're going to look at the powers of Congress, and as you read in Chapter 11, those are outlined in the Constitution. What exactly powers, specific powers. Now, the expressed powers you must understand, and these vocab words, expressed powers are powers that are clearly written in the Constitution. For example, if it says Congress has the power to tax, right in the Constitution, that would be called an expressed power. However, there are other powers, primarily implied powers. That means it doesn't say, if you get out your Constitution, it doesn't say Congress has the power to set a minimum wage, for example. You'll never find that in the Constitution, but yet Congress has set a minimum wage for America. How is that possible? Well, the reason is because the power to do so is implied in the Constitution under their authority to govern commerce. So now the question that you might have is how do you decide if it's implied in there or not? Well, that is up to the Supreme Court. So please bear in mind that if you or anybody has doubt whether Congress is overstepping its power, the recourse that you have is to take them to court and say, for example, recently the health care reform, Obamacare, was challenged in the courts and went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that yes, Congress had the power. It was implied under the general welfare that they could set up a national health care plan. So if you're in doubt, you can take it to court and decide if it really is implied in there or not. Thus, you can see how powerful the Supreme Court is because the Supreme Court gets to decide these matters. The third type of power is called inherent power. That means power that is just simply worked into the system. It's inherent, it's built in, they have to have that power in order to run as a large government. Strict constructionists now, historically, would like the Congress to stick strictly to what's written in the Constitution or very clearly implied, and not stretch it and give Congress more power to influence more areas of our life. On the other hand, liberal constructionists wanted to see America's Congress get more and more power and to stretch what was talked about in the Constitution. Let's take an example of one power. The Constitution does give the Congress the power to tax. As you can see, it's written right in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Therefore, you guessed it, it's a expressed power. There's no implying necessary. It's written right in there. Expressed power, as we talked about. However, there are some limits, and you can read through these 4 limits. They cannot just tax to build themselves fancy houses or whatever. It must be for public means, and it must be fairly administered, and so on. So, of course, as you probably imagine by now, the Congress has taken advantage of this power, and yes, they have taxed us. And what do they do with all the tax money? Well, they run the government, defend the country, set aside for Social Security, Medicare, and pay off interest on loans and so on. Unfortunately, the Constitution also gives expressed power of Congress to borrow money. And as you probably have guessed, they have taken advantage of that power as well. And Congress, to this point, is over $17 trillion in debt. So there is deficit financing going on. Each year we end up borrowing more money than we take in, and so it gets worse and worse and becoming a great public burden. So we as Christians then would frown on such activity because God tells us in the Bible to be good stewards of what He has given to us and not to overreach and to borrow what we cannot pay back, because the Bible also teaches that the borrower is slave to the lender, and that it's wrong to borrow that you know you can't pay back as well, and we need to live within our means. So these biblical points are being avoided today by our Congress, and they continue to get deeper and deeper in debt. They do have commerce power also on taxation and monitoring of trade, as you know. They also, if you have a bankruptcy situation, the Congress sets the rules for bankruptcy. The Congress also decides what is called legal tender. What can you use to pay? If you look at your money in your pocket, it'll say it's set as legal tender by the Congress of America. Congress also has foreign relations power and war powers. You think of usually associate that with the executive branch, but Congress also can vote on the use of military and also on major treaties. Must be approved. So some of the express powers that you could see here from your textbook, there's a few listed here, and peacetime powers, but there are many others that you should read about in your text. The one that we want to mention next is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And this is sort of an elastic clause which allows Congress to pass things that are necessary and proper to carry it out. And so oftentimes things will fall under here, implied in the necessary and proper clause. So examples then, it says you can borrow money, and then it implies they can do this. They can collect taxes, which implies they can punish tax evaders, regulate the sale of things, and so on. They can raise army, it says that right in there, it's expressed, so that means then that they can run a draft and so on. So again, if there's any questions over whether it's really implied in there or not, then you need to take that to court. The cartoonist here obviously is implying that the Constitution does not give the government the right to make a national health care. So what's happening? The president is adding that. So obviously the cartoonists is feeling that it was a bit of a stretch to try to say that the Constitution supports giving Congress enough power to create a national health care plan. Now others could argue that it's implied in there. And so again, cartoonists can bring out their opinions in such ways. The House has the power to impeach a president, and that has happened twice. Most recently with President Bill Clinton was impeached by the House. However, the president is allowed to finish his term even as impeached unless he is then tried in the Senate and found guilty, then he's thrown out of office. But in both cases, the impeached president was tried then secondly in the Senate, and by a narrow margin was not found guilty and therefore was allowed to finish his term. But the impeachment power is up to the House of Representatives, and if they're convicted in the Senate, then they're removed from office, as I mentioned. Congress also has some executive power. The Senate particularly can approve of different appointments and treaties, and so there's some executive power. Remember the checks and balances back and forth, that the legislative branch must have some executive power to check the executive branch and judicial power to check the judicial branch, so that they all check each other. One of the more interesting powers they have is investigatory power. Congress can investigate anybody, even the president, as you saw with Gerald Ford. They called him before a committee, congressional committee, to testify under oath about pardoning Nixon. So Congress can call in anybody to investigate, to call attention to military leaders, civilian leaders, business leaders, any sports figures. Congress can investigate anything to call attention to that.